So welcome everyone. We are here today with Meghan Stewart from the Kamloops Museum and Archives, and we are doing a number of programs this month to celebrate Women's History Month. So we're really excited to have Meghan here with us today to do a bit of a talk about women in history, focusing specifically on some of the women who've been involved in the collections at the KMA. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Meghan.
All right. Hi, guys. So like Mick said, my name is Meghan. I'm a museum educator here at the Kamloops Museum and Archives. So that means a lot of my role is forward-facing programming, education programs, things like that. And like Meg mentioned as well, we are collaborating on a number of different things this autumn, specifically for Women's History Month this month. So I encourage you all to participate, conduct your research, and learn more about some of the wonderful women who have influenced history here in Kamloops. So before we begin with our talk today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are located on Kamloops Secwepemc territory within the traditional and unceded lands of the Secwepemc Nation. I would also like to acknowledge women throughout history and around the world who have been underrepresented, understudied, and underacknowledged throughout history and around the world today. Now, I am going to share only a small piece of women's history here in the Kamloops area, but my hope is that by taking a broad timepiece, I will be able to highlight a few of the innumerable contributions that have been made by women throughout Canadian history and the history of this land. Now, I would like to start my talk out with a shout out to the Secwepemc Museum and Heritage Park. If you haven't had an opportunity to visit there, please do check them out when they reopen. Their displays are amazing, and the gardens and walking trails are amazing as well. Women played a huge and important role in Secwepemc society since time immemorial, and I would like to recognize them and their role on this land before we continue. Our colleagues at the Secwepemc Museum are well versed in their roles and are much better equipped to share their stories than we are here at the KMA. I would like to acknowledge these women and their importance, but in an effort to amplify community voices and in the equitable sharing of history, I will leave further exploration to the Secwepemc Museum as they are the experts in this matter. So our talk today will begin in our collection with the role of Indigenous women during the fur trade. And I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen with you here so that you can have a look at some of the photos that we have in our collection. So this photo is taken from our fur trade gallery. It is an artist's interpretation of an Indigenous woman during the fur trade. Now, when European fur traders arrived in the Kamloops area around 1811, they were largely reliant on the Secwepemc to help them navigate and survive the changing seasons in Kamloops. By 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company had established a monopoly on the fur trade in the Kamloops area. And unlike other fur trading companies, the Hudson's Bay Company initially strongly discouraged and even outright banned fraternization and relationships between their fur traders and Indigenous women. Since the Hudson's Bay Company headquarters were located in London and Kamloops was a journey of many months away, there is some debate about how successful this rule was. Eventually, however, the Hudson's Bay Company began to realize that relationships between fur traders and Indigenous women had many benefits for them, perhaps from observation of other fur trade companies, or perhaps even from observation of their own fur traders. These relationships forged political bridges between the fur traders and Indigenous peoples, and they allowed for the exchange of language and customs. Relationships between Indigenous women and fur traders were formalized à la façon du pays, or in the way of the country, and, given their many benefits, were generally considered to be respectable partnerships on all parts. Unfortunately, many fur traders had wives and children who remained in Europe, and some of these relationships were simply abandoned when fur traders returned to Europe. Others remained successful. The children of these relationships were able to speak multiple languages, were familiar with the culture and customs of both societies, and were able, in some cases, to successfully navigate both. Women also played an enormous role in the fur trade itself, and I can't emphasize this enough because as much as women are left out of the story of the fur trade, it could not have happened without the labor that they provided. Indigenous women served as guides, interpreters, mentors, and mediators between European and Indigenous society. Women were also responsible for the bulk of the labor regarding the processing of animal hides and the creation of goods that allowed the fur trade to flourish. They cured and prepared animal skins. They made moccasins, which European fur traders adopted very soon after their arrival, and snowshoes. They were also largely responsible for the preservation and preparation of food. In many ways, the story of the fur trade is a common thread that we see throughout history of women providing labor that allows for progress and industry to thrive, but receiving very little credit beyond the occasional footnote in the history books. I want to emphasize this again because I really don't think it can be said enough. The fur trade literally would not have happened if it wasn't for the labor that women provided. As the fur trade drew to a close, Kamloops received an influx of miners and miner wannabes with the gold rush of the 1850s. The invitation of British Columbia into Confederation included plans for the construction of a railway line connecting British Columbia to the rest of the country, and in 1885 that dream was realized, bringing forth a wave of Victorian European settlement into the Kamloops area. Before this occurs, however, we have the arrival of the Overlanders. And this name is probably familiar to many people in the audience. After all, we do have the Overlanders Bridge and the statue in front of City Hall commemorating their achievements. Another name that likely is familiar is this woman in the photograph right here. And this is Catherine Schubert. And Schubert arrived in the Kamloops area with her husband Augustus and their 3 small children in 1862. And I would encourage anyone in the audience who has children or even who has met a small child to imagine how difficult that journey would have been to make with 3 young children. And of course, this is before the train has gone through, so they would have been traveling without the help of mechanized travel. And even beyond that, Catherine was also pregnant as they traveled, and she gave birth to a daughter in October of that year. Her daughter, Rose Schubert, was the first European child born in the Kamloops area. Now, when I say Victorian, many of you probably have some ideas that jump into your heads, corsets and strict morals and devout religiosity. And the Victorian era is marked, of course, by the 63-year reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. And to provide you with some context, many important historic events take place during her reign in Canadian history. So in 1867, Confederation occurs. In 1870, British Columbia joins Confederation. And in 1893, Kamloops officially incorporates as a city. So soon after Catherine Schubert and her family arrive in the Kamloops area, there's an influx of population growth. And for the first time, this population growth really includes women and families. So prior to this, immigration in Kamloops was largely dominated by men, so fur traders, gold miners, and railway workers. But with the arrival of the railway, we see the arrival of more and more women. These women and their families settle in Kamloops at an interesting time, with the rise of mass-produced goods starting to happen. Almost as a response to this, women begin to craft decor for their houses, including hair wreaths like this one pictured here. Now, it may seem odd to us now, maybe even a little bit gross, but these hair wreaths were so popular during Victorian times that one could send away in the mail order catalog to receive special glue that would preserve the hair. These wreaths were a record for women of love, loss, and family. It was common for them to take care from their children and loved ones, both living and dead, to craft their wreath. And this may seem like a morbid tradition, but don't forget that the Victorian period was a time of death portraits and fashionable mourning. So when Queen Victoria's husband died in 1861, she began mourning and remained in mourning for 40 years until her death in 1901. So it is perhaps for this reason, the influence of a powerful woman, that mourning and death became fashionable throughout the Victorian era. Now, hair also played a very sentimental role for women during the Victorian era. Young girls wore their hair down or in braids, but once a woman grew up, she was expected to wear her hair up, as you may have noticed in Catherine Schubert's portrait here. So you can see her hair is very much tied up, tucked out of the way, and not being shown. Even in literature, we see the obsession with hair. So in the iconic Canadian novel Anne of Green Gables, Anne asks Diana for a lock of hair when they think they are going to be parted forever. And she says she will sew it up in a bag and wear it around her neck for the rest of her life. Now, this particular hair wreath was crafted by Mrs. Sarah D. Kidder around 1860. She lived in North Kamloops from 1904 to 1918, and this artifact was donated by her great-granddaughter to the KMA. And one of my favorite things to do when I give tours of the museum, particularly to school kids, is to bring them to this artifact and ask them to guess what it's made of. And the answers vary wildly, you know, from natural things, wood and fibers and things like that. But it's very, very rare that someone will actually guess hair as the medium for the creation of this. So this is really a unique product that we see Victorian women creating and crafting as far as creation goes. Now, a Kamloopsian whose photographs many of us have likely seen but may not have attributed to her is Mary Spencer. So prior to COVID, some of you guys might have had the opportunity to come to the KMA, to the Children's Museum, and to do the giant magnetic puzzle up on the wall. And that puzzle, that photo, is actually taken by Mary Spencer. So Spencer was born in 1857 in St. Catharines, Ontario. She worked for a time as a teacher and developed her skills in oil painting and photography. Following her relocation with her sister Isabel to Kamloops in 1898, Spencer opened a photography studio in 1899, and from this studio she offered oil painting classes as well as portraiture and photography for Kamloopsians. In 1903, she purchased the property at 218 Victoria Street, so I encourage you all to go and check out the address and see what's there now. And she actually hired an architect to construct a new studio and living quarters above. And of course, this seems like, you know, here's a woman who's venturing out and she's taking part in the community, she's purchasing property, but don't forget, at the turn of the century, this would have been extremely radical for her to be able to go out, purchase property on her own, and to be doing so without a husband or partner. So her portraits quickly became popular among Kamloopsians, and her scenic photographs of Kamloops were made in postcards and souvenir books. And I would bet that most of you in the Kamloops area have seen at least one Mary Spencer photograph in your lifetime, perhaps not even realized that it was her. She is actually probably most famous for her photographs of train robber Bill Miner and his gang, which she took for the Vancouver Daily Province and published in the Kamloops Standard as well. So even here at the museum, the photos that you'll see of Bill Miner are Mary Spencer photos. And Spencer moved to Summerland in 1909 with her sister Isabel and sold her photography business to Mrs. L.M. Walker. Here she continued to take photographs, painted china, she was active in the church community, and she assisted Isabel in cultivating their orchard. Spencer died in 1938 from pneumonia. So this brings us to the turn of the century in Kamloops, and I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen again because I have a couple more photos I'd like to share with you. So we'll jump in here. Perfect. So the population here is once again beginning to rise with the completion of the CPR Railway in 1885. And with this rise in population, the Kamloops community needed more than a transient CPR doctor who merely visited the community. So that same year, the Royal Inland Hospital was constructed on Lorne Street. And for those of you who maybe have come in and checked out our current temporary exhibition, Recovery Drive, you will have seen the photos of the hospital on Lorne Street with chickens pecking about in the road out front. Very interesting photos, really gives you some idea of what life might have been like back then. Interestingly, although we often think of nursing as a profession typically carried out by women, the Royal Inland Hospital was initially staffed nearly entirely by men, including the nursing staff. And this would have been typical for the times that men would have been both nurses and doctors in the hospital. This quickly changed, however, with the hospital's first matron, Eleanor Potter, in 1887. So it's not too long after the hospital was built that women really began to take on an active role in nursing in the hospital. By 1904, Jean Matheson, who is the nurse pictured in the photograph here, took over as the hospital's second matron. And Matheson is a really interesting character. Not only is she the second nursing matron at Royal Inland Hospital, but she also is the first head of the Royal Inland Hospital Training School for Nurses, which was also founded in 1904. 3 years later, Matheson would leave her position at Royal Inland Hospital and become the first nursing matron at the newly founded Chancellor Sanatorium, which is a hospital carried out aimed at caring for tuberculosis patients in British Columbia. Now, we don't hear very much about tuberculosis anymore, but at the turn of the century, it was actually the cause of death for roughly a quarter of Europeans. In 1867, it is the leading cause of death in Canada. So this is an epidemic of huge proportions that is really influential for a lot of people throughout their lives. But tuberculosis has some really interesting roots with women as well. So during the Victorian era, you'll recall we're talking about death portraiture, an obsession with mourning and with death. Tuberculosis reaches epidemic proportions. It's the cause of death for roughly a quarter of Europeans, and the effects of the disease actually begin to be equated with female beauty. So this sort of waifishness, which of course would have been caused by lack of appetite, was emphasized by corsets, and the height of beauty was sparkling, dilated eyes, pale skin, flushed cheeks, rosy lips, which of course would be caused by a recurrent low-grade fever synonymous with tuberculosis. And these effects were actually emphasized and romanticized by Victorian society. It is perhaps in this way that tuberculosis becomes known as something of a women's disease. Women were thought to be made more beautiful as they were slowly dying of tuberculosis. And we do see the prominence of tuberculosis among housewives who, of course, would be working in less well-ventilated places indoors and were more susceptible to catching this disease. Now, women also played an important role in founding the Thompson-Nicola Sanatorium. Oh, and this is the nursing school. Sorry, I missed this one. So this is the graduation from the nursing school. But here we have women members of the BC Anti-Tuberculosis Society, which was instrumental in purchasing the property and creating what would be the first sanatorium west of Ontario in Canada. And Canada, of course, comes a little bit late to the sanatorium movement. By the time we start having sanatoriums, wealthy Europeans have already been taking the cure, as it was called, in the southern United States for decades. So this is not a new phenomenon, but it is something new to Canada. And the Thompson-Nicola Sanatorium was actually cutting edge in many respects. Despite taking on patients who were largely advanced cases of tuberculosis, with of course the intention being to keep them from the rest of society, the more infectious, the more sick a person with tuberculosis becomes, the more infectious they become. So needing to isolate them was very, very important. The sanatorium actually had excellent outcomes, and it operated successfully until 1958. Nursing staff lived on site and were extremely vocal about their rights, and they actually staged a protest at one point for better living quarters, and you can see in photographs that they'll be carrying around a briefcase with signs on them demanding better rights and a better place to live. Back at Royal Inland Hospital, the nursing school trained nurses until its last intake in 1971. When the last class of nurses graduated in 1974, the program shifted to Cariboo College, which of course is currently Thompson Rivers University. And I would like to bring us back to the present and to the Kamloops Museum and Archives. For those of you who may have visited the KMA, you will have seen our third floor gallery, River People, Nation State People. And these items of clothing are just a few pieces, a few artifacts from that exhibition. Now, this exhibition was created in the spirit of collaboration and included collaboration with artist Tanya Willard. Tanya, whose biography includes that she is of Secwepemc and settler heritage, works with shifting ideas around contemporary and traditional. This is particularly applicable here at the Kamloops Museum, which explores the intersection between the European tradition of the museum and the contemporary exhibition of Indigenous arts and culture. Her work here included the selection of images and objects and writing of text. Museums often have a habit of displaying Indigenous cultures as being something historic, although they are very much still around, present and contemporary today. So this exhibition seeks to explore and unpack that a little bit. So one of the things that Tanya found in the collection that I would like to share includes these articles of clothing. Now, when they were taken into the collection, having been created in the 1960s, they were actually labeled as replicas. But as Tanya pointed out, these are actually examples of contemporary Indigenous art, and they should be displayed as such. So these pieces are now displayed as part of our permanent gallery and attributed to the artist who created them, Emma Gottfredson. This is just one example of the ways in which museums as a whole are beginning to re-examine their collections, their archives, and their best practices, particularly around the sharing of stories, the inclusion of community voices, and the sharing of history. And now we also have a variety of women from cultural societies within Kamloops who have collaborated and continue to collaborate with the KMA as we seek to represent a diverse, equitable history of our community. I want to highlight and acknowledge Mona Lavina, who worked with us last September to put on a Culture Days event that shared Filipino culture through a variety of crafts, activities, and performances. For those of you who may have come to see it, they had a beautiful video of shadow puppets that shared a creation story, and her daughter actually did dancing, which was so wonderful as well. I would also like to highlight Margot Mercier, who, as the Executive Director of the Francophone Association, collaborated with us this winter to put on a Cabana Souk and Carnival events. So that happened in January and February of this year, and both were wonderful and very, very successful as well. So there are countless other women in the community who have served as connections to some of our cultural communities, and we are so fortunate to have had their input and voices at the table at the KMA. One of the things that many people don't realize about the Kamloops Museum all the time is that as a community museum, we are dependent on donations from the community for our collection. This means that there are some significant gaps and absences in the stories that we are able to tell. You may have noticed in this talk, for example, that I was able to tell the stories of several individual European women, and yet I had to focus on the role of Indigenous women during the fur trade as a broad group. So these are things that are missing from our collection that we aren't able to speak to. This makes it even more important that these women are helping us to bridge these gaps, reassess and re-examine our collection as it currently stands, and to share a history of Kamloops that is inclusive and equitable. It is interesting to note that as a community museum, the Kamloops Museum and Archives has actually been led majoritarily by women. So from its first professional employee, Mary Balfe, to our current supervisor, women have largely held the leadership roles here at the Kamloops Museum. And this is actually an interesting trend because it's common across community museums everywhere. But it is interesting to note that women are still largely excluded from the upper management of large museums, especially large museums with large budgets. So still seeing a little bit of that glass ceiling effect, but interesting to note that women are taking more of a leadership role, particularly in community-oriented museums. So what I have been able to share with you today is just a small fraction of the women of Kamloops who have helped to make our history. There are many, many, many more stories to be told, and I hope that this brief talk has inspired your sense of curiosity. I would invite you to research and explore other women who have had an impact here, not just through the KMA and our archives, but also through the Secwepemc Museum, the various cultural associations and societies in town, and even the women in your own family. Ask them about their story, their history, their connection to our community, and encourage them to share it with others, because these stories are so, so important. And often they are lost and left out of the archives and the traditional narrative of history. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. And I think I'm gonna jump back in with Meg and maybe have some questions. And if you have any questions as well, you can feel free to follow up with Meg or with myself at the KMA as well.
Oh, that was so fantastic, Megan. Thank you. And yes, definitely, we will be keeping an eye on any questions that come in, and we'll make sure that those get to Megan so that we can answer some of them for you, since we're not going to have a bit of a live Q&A. I had a couple of things that I sort of jotted down that really sparked my interest listening to you. I was thinking, about Mary Spencer. I think we actually have a copy of her biography here in the library, which is called A Steady Lens. So I'll make sure that I link that for anybody who might be interested in reading up a bit more about her. And it's interesting too, thinking just about Tranquille, which, the North Kamloops Library is on Tranquille. It's a word that we're so familiar with using as a street name. But everyone might not be aware sort of where that name comes from or the history of it, and especially right now with, the epidemic that we're living through at the moment, thinking about being in isolation, tuberculosis. There's a lot of parallels, I think, that can be drawn between sort of that experience at the time and what we're all experiencing now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth noting about Tranquille, I don't know if anybody in the audience maybe has had a chance to head out there and to visit and to take a look. But, you know, by most accounts, it was a pretty okay place to be. They had these beautiful sunken gardens that were a real tourist draw. Like, people would journey from Kamloops out to Tranquil on the weekends to visit these gardens. They had a 15-hole golf course at one point that they put in, a weekly moving picture show as moving pictures become available. They have all kinds of crafts and activities for patients and things. So by all accounts, it seems like it was, you know, a fairly good place to pass the time if you know, were having to be isolated. And patients seem to have a pretty good experience there. So I know there's sometimes this like idea that it's like a spooky old, you know, hospital and things like that. But I don't think that was necessarily the patient experience being there.
I know that the hands-on history program that we're doing right now, the contest, some of the recipes we have come from a cookbook put together by Tranquil staff, which is in the KMA collection. And I know that reading through the introduction of that, you know, the staff are saying these are our favorite recipes. They've been shared, you know, by our spouses, they're favorites of everyone, and a lot of them seem like really yummy desserts. So it seems like at least there was, you know, a lot of care and attention that came from the staff who were working there.
Definitely. And I think it's, you know, it's worth noting too that Tranquil is a community, right? Doctors, nurses, staff lived on site there. And, you know, there are definitely still members of the community today who maybe had parents who worked there, who lived out there as children. And, you know, they have, from every account I've heard, they have really wonderful memories of living out there. So
very different from the way we sort of have medical establishments set up now, to think of it as more of a community space caring for people.
Yeah,
than
definitely.
just a place people work. So so interesting. I know the hair wreaths too is just so fascinating. You get a lot of strange things coming out of the Victorian period, but I think that's one that I hadn't really heard about very much before. I think I'd heard of hair, like having rings with hair in them, but not actually making a wreath. I feel like that might be a really interesting craft for people to try and take on. But
I would encourage people to try that. I think it would be very, very difficult to try to get like those intricate little flowers and stuff.
Definitely think that your first attempts might not look exactly like sort of those finished products. The amount of skill must have just been amazing.
Yeah,
to go into those.
For sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions, you can drop them into the comments and we will make sure that we get back to you.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Meg. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.